Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History here at the Keeney Graduate School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation this evening. If you're not familiar with the Gotham Center, as ever, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, hundreds of event recordings, dozens of podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a more interpersonal experience should check out Gotham Ed, our online adult education program offering mini courses by leading experts at gothamed.com. We'll be posting this year's courses shortly. Tonight, as part of our regular series featuring some of the most interesting new research into New York City's history, we'll be discussing this new book by Michael J. Douma entitled The Slow Death of Slavery in Dutch New York, A Cultural, Economic, and Demographic History. It's not often that I read a well-respected academic press claiming in the description of its book, quote, "This important study will reshape the literature in the field." But that's the case. But this is a case where that kind of prediction seems very well called for. Slavery was a central fact of New York's history. By 1750, the colony had the largest population of slaves outside the South, and by 1790, New York City had more slaves than any city in the United States but Charleston. There were no major plantations in the state, but with frequent trading and renting, the system was even more common than such large numbers imply. Yet the historical research on slavery in New York has been modest by comparison, say, with the antebellum South. The documentary record, scattered in dozens of state, regional, and local archives, and often poorly cataloged, has posed a major challenge to scholars who have often relied on the collections of wealthy families or governmental histories for this piece of New York's history. The best histories of slavery in the United States also give little attention to New York unless they are focused heavily, or else are focused heavily on New York City. But our guest tonight, drawing on several unique databases he pooled and created, argues persuasively that much of what we think we know about slavery in New York is wrong. In 7 chapters, he aims to demolish no less than 8 major claims that scholars have made, in some dramatically reframing that history. I will leave it to our guest to elaborate what those myths are, but in short, he argues that slavery in New York was profitable, rural, economically and culturally distinct, and to a great extent, Dutch, even into the early 1800s, when activists and slaves themselves brought the institution to a far from inevitable political death. I am looking forward to this conversation as much as anyone here. But first, allow me to introduce our guest before we get going. Michael J. Douma is associate professor in the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, where he also directs the Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics. He is the author of several books and essays in professional journals focused particularly on slavery in 19th century America and the Dutch Empire, as well as the methods and philosophy of history. Formerly an editor for Sage Publishers' Economic History series, he is currently the books review editor for the Journal of Markets and Morality, and has been very active in public history too, especially in the realm of historic preservation and folklore. A proud native of Michigan, he holds a PhD from Florida State University and now lives, as he writes, in a book-filled cabin in the mountains of West Virginia. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome him here from the tragically unmountainous streets of New York City. I'm delighted as well that Nicole Mesquiel could join us this evening as moderator. Nicole is Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Dartmouth College, where she focuses on colonial history, particularly the networks of slavery in the Dutch and British Northeast. Her first book, Bound by Bondage, Slavery and the Creation of a Northern Gentry, was published by Cornell University Press and won the Hendricks Award from the New Netherland Institute. Her first article, published in the New England Quarterly, won the Nupur Chowdhury First Article Prize from the Coordinating Council for Women in History. She is currently editing a series for the University of Massachusetts Press, spotlighting research on the history of African-descended people in New England from the colonial period to the present. I don't think we could have found a better pairing, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So just one last piece of conversation housekeeping before we start. As usual, the chat and hand-raising functions in Zoom have been disabled out of respect to our speakers. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to do so at any point in the next hour, and we'll begin answering those questions around 7:30 or so. So with that, I hope you'll all join me in welcoming our guests now with a bit of silent applause.
All right. I guess that's my cue, Peter. I wasn't sure if it is or not. First of all, I just want to say it's a honor. It's great to be welcomed by the Gotham Center to speak, and it's also just incredible to have somebody who has read the book and describes it so well, Peter. I mean, that's just a fantastic introduction. You've already done half of my work for me, so I thank you for that. Lastly, as we were preparing for this talk just a few minutes ago, Nicole and I mentioned how we have emailed quite a bit, but we've never really spoken. So this is a conversation that's been meaning to happen for 5 years. We have a lot to say, I think mostly friendly, but we also have things to work out between us about the historiography of New York. So I'm really excited to get into that. I wanted to start with a PowerPoint, and I'm going to share this just 5 or 6 slides with you. And it's going to take me just 5 or 6 minutes to go through them. So let me try to work first on sharing my screen. Should be right there. Okay, so you should be able to see that. Is that good? Okay, good. All right. Now, as Peter mentioned, this book is an attempt on my part. Well, I wouldn't say it began as an attempt to rewrite the historiography, the big picture of slavery in New York. In fact, I think all too often, historians in the US and Europe, I was trained a little bit in the Netherlands as well, they approach historical problems by saying, you must have a question. You must, what are you looking to answer? Go out there and find the sources to answer your question. But a hero of mine, a folklorist, anthropologist named Henry Glassy, often said something like, when you go out into the field to do research as a folklorist, as an anthropologist, you don't always know what questions you are going to ask. So the initial questions that I had were questions about profitability of slavery, things that were very common in the literature on slavery in the South. And I thought to myself, well, I'm an economic historian now. I'm going to prove to people I am. So I'm going to find a bunch of data and I'm going to talk about whether slavery in the North was efficient, profitable, these types of debates. But it didn't really turn out that way. As I looked into the research, dug into archives, I found all sorts of other stuff that to me uh, uh, didn't what's the word, jive or fit with the stuff that I was reading in the secondary books on New York. And so in my generally unorthodox manner, I did a lot of my research before I read the secondary works, at least many of them, because I wanted to come up with my own view first, read the other works and say, oh, wow, I don't agree. So here's a list of questions that I came up with as I was doing my research, in which I eventually have answers to as well. So, was slavery in New York urban or rural? We can talk about this, but most historians treat it as an urban phenomenon. It's wrong. I mean, it's clearly, demonstrably, factually wrong. This was mostly a rural phenomenon. Dutch or English. So, I had published some articles before this book on this topic. Um, Trying to measure Dutch language in New York and the number of slaves who may have spoken Dutch. I come up with something like 40%, and this is actually consistent throughout the entire 18th century for various reasons. You would think it would decline, but it doesn't. Slavery among the Dutch grows, even as the language is dying off. I argue that slavery is profitable in New York. This is a long-standing debate. I can't explain all these now. I have whole chapters on each one of these topics. I argue that the growth in New York was domestic, that slavery didn't grow because of importing slaves. I mean, it did until 1750 or 1760, but then it stopped. Um, and then this is a point that goes also against many of the new books on this topic. I argue that slaves in New York were actually quite mobile. So even though they were controlled, they moved around a lot and they were able to form their own communities, connections, relationships, etc. To do this work, I began as an empirical historian, and they say if you can count it, you better count it, right? So I was upset that a lot of um, books on slavery in New York and in the North did not use numbers. In fact, they said stuff that was very vague. A few slaves here, some enslaved persons there, etc. Really didn't give you a good sense of what was going on. There's lots of dissertations, however, that sort of cite census numbers. but very uncritically, like with no training whatsoever in demography. Okay, so I also try to answer questions about the demise of slavery in New York, whether it's political, economic, cultural, demographic, something else. And in doing so, I try to measure the number of slaves that were potentially sold south. It's a kind of controversial topic with a literature dating back to the 70s with some hints before then. And then I've revised the numbers of that are given in the census for various reasons. And I talk about how many slaves in New York were actually emancipated in 1827, and it's very few. So even though slavery ended in 1827, most enslaved people had died during the process of gradual emancipation, which had begun 28 years earlier, either died or if they were born, of course, they were made into indentured servants, children of slaves bound to service, as they said. And these children actually stayed bound to service until, in many cases, the late 1840s. So slavery in New York both died quicker and slower than one might imagine, depending on how you look at it. Okay, so let me just do some of these other slides. I'll try to be quick. I've done a lot with measuring numbers, and I studied demography specifically, even brought in a professor of demography to help me with some of this work, and a professor of economics actually on another chapter. And so if you buy the book, you'll notice they have a lot of numbers, that a lot of graphs and charts to express these numbers and try to show you where slavery was and how it grew and declined. Then I really try to emphasize how Dutch this was, that there were slaves that were speaking Dutch, and not just one or two in some small enclaves, but rather whole villages of Dutch-speaking slaves, monolingual ones even into the 1810s and 20s, because you have runaway slave advertisements that say this specifically, that they speak Dutch and no English, or Dutch with just a few words of English, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a process of bilingualism that's developing in New York among these slaves, but there's a very clear Dutch speaking group of slaves. One of the other developments that I look at is the process of slavery's demise in New York. And so I call it the slow death, especially among the Dutch. So they resisted this more than their English Anglo neighbors. And there's also in this sort of whitewashing of this early history. And so one of the, I take this influence from Simon Schama to use some art, not as an illustration, but to actually explain something. So we have an image of a slave farm in New York. And if you see on the left, the slave is in the image when this was made. I think the first one was during the period of slavery. The second one on the right was after slavery's demise, and they had removed him from the image. And I feel like that's what's gone on in New York. The history of New York has removed slavery from its story, and it's unfortunate, and I think frankly absurd that this is such an important topic that needs to be talked about. Lastly, this work that I've done here is grounded on the most tedious database collecting, analytic focus on sources that I've ever done, that that I have trouble finding ones to compare to, because it's just so meticulous, the amount of time that I spend on some of these things. And some of it is just reading the census page by page and figuring out how the enumerators made mistakes. So, and I've been doing more work on this for Pennsylvania now, and I'm gonna maybe for the rest of New England, but these enumerators were terrible. They put things in the wrong categories all the time. And the more you study, this is almost like studying ancient Akkadian, Babylonian texts or something, because after a while you figure out that there's ghost marks, there's bleed over marks between the pages, numbers are slanted the wrong way. So if you see this image here too, this image in front of you, you might think, oh, there's two people counted on this. Maybe you see some scratches on the left and you think four. It's not very clear. And then sometimes you go to the bottom of the page and it doesn't add up in the totals, or you go to the right of the page and it adds up but not on the bottom. And so there's all these ways to double check it. And so even though I feel that I've made a big argument about a number of things, I've tried to make every one of these arguments grounded as much as possible on data and on facts. So with that, I'm ready for the hardball, curveball, softball questions, whatever Nicole wants to throw in my direction.
Well, I'm really excited to be here as well, and really eager to dive into this very meaty work. But first, I wanted to kind of get a sense of what brought you to this topic and what motivated you to explore this gradual end of slavery in Dutch New York. Were you expecting to find what you found? Were there any surprises? How did you come to this?
Good question. Thanks. So I began as a kid in Michigan going to Hope College. I had taken German in high school, so I had the opportunity to learn Dutch at Hope College. And I worked in the archives there for 4 years, and I became obsessed with the Netherlands. And so a lot of my research for the 20 years, in fact, leading up to this book, was on Dutch topics. But I had also been teaching slavery and capitalism. I had learned a lot of economic history. And I had been primarily studying the Dutch in the Midwest and in the Caribbean and the Netherlands. I hadn't got into the New York Dutch, but I felt like this was inevitable. And then I thought, this is, as one of my mentor in Michigan, Robert Swearinga, uses the term salient. And he doesn't mean the Battle of the Bulge salient. He means important. And he says, you need to study the salient topics. You need to find the important ones, not just where the audience is, but where you can say something important. And I think too often in the past, I had studied things only because I was interested in them, not because anybody else would be interested in them. And so I thought, here's a real opportunity to contribute and to use some disciplines that maybe others hadn't been using. I've studied some law, economics, demography, whereas a lot of the histories in New York are social, cultural, political, and I felt like they needed more grounding in some of these other disciplines, and that hopefully the story that I've told, even if it people end up criticizing it or going in different directions with it, can be useful for them. Like, I don't see how you can write the cultural history until you know the statistical base of the story.
Mhm. I really like this, and this is I'm gonna go somewhere I didn't think I was gonna go here first, but I really wanted to hit this point you made, and your focus on this demographic analysis is really the crucial part of how you uncover these new insights, which are really new about the Dutch-speaking enslaved population. This is what really distinguishes, right? I mean, to me, this is what really jumps out and distinguishes your work from other studies. I'm wondering, like, in the process of doing this work, I'm so glad that you shared your slides and showed like how this is not just a process of counting, but also unraveling the methods used by the demographers, right? What were or the census takers? What were some of the most surprising findings you came across? And can you tell us specifically about how this approach can be useful in kind of giving a greater depth or clarity to understanding new aspects to enslavement in places like New York or across the Northeast?
Yeah,
And
good question. Good questions. So it's quite technical. I mean, it's not. I mean, I'm sure everyone here can figure it out. It's not incredible. It's not like Fourier analysis or something, but it is technical. The demographic um, type of research that I did, and it uses something called imputed linear curves to measure population flows over time. And so to make sure that this wasn't premiering in the book to get criticized, I did publish that one as an article in advance in the Journal of Early American History, I think. And I had a professional demographer from Minnesota, J. David Hacker, take a look at it, comment on things, and provide me with lots of insights. Essentially, you have to understand how many slaves there were in New York. You can't just use the census. That's part of it. You also have to understand birth rates and death rates. You have to understand imports and exports. You have to understand that a population is always in flow, right? And so you have to make estimates about these things. We don't know the birth rate, we don't know the death rate, but we can compare them to other known rates at other times, and we can get as much data as possible on imports and exports, or runaway slaves is another contribution to the absolute numbers. And so you plug all this into your calculator and you get a range. And you say, well, I couldn't possibly adjust this birth rate higher or lower, right? So then these are the numbers. And unless we come up with evidence of something else, like 1,000 slaves in New York moving somewhere else, it's not going to change the numbers that much. And so you're going to be in this range. And so the point is, in the 18th century, I discovered, to my surprise, I got to remember the actual number, 78,000 or something like this, total number of slaves that set foot in New York at any point. And that I said 40%. So my can't do calculation on the fly, but between 22 and 30,000 of these slaves in New York spoke Dutch, right? So these are, to me, that was surprising right away, because previous estimates had put it at like 8 to 15% or something like this. I mean, so yeah, once you know how big the Dutch slave population is, you start to see other things going on. Where are they? What's the point of having so many slaves? And then you start seeing, well, they're in the rural areas, and all the people that die that have slaves have certain farm equipment. They're all farming wheat. And it's like, why are they doing that? How is that profitable, right? So it leads to all these other questions. And it pulled me further and further away from New York City, where the Gotham Center, I know, is New York City focused, but there's a lot of research done on it that's pretty good. Shane White's work in particular, I think, is great. I don't ever find things wrong with his book, but this new stuff points us to New York State in general as the place where this story is developing, not just in the city. And if we have this conception of slavery in the North as urban and English speaking, we got it all wrong, right? So that's the first thing then that surprised me and flips this story around. And I've reviewed Nicole's work on this, and I know that she focuses outside of the city as well with these elite families, and has made some great contributions in that. So I think what's important is that we reorient the story, and this is one of the first ones. It's big. There's lots of slaves. A lot of them speak Dutch, and it's a Hudson Valley story, and Long Island, but mostly Hudson Valley.
Yeah. One thing that I also thought was, in terms of my own research, maybe taking me a bit to task, and I think in the best way possible, was how you show how everyday Dutch families, not just the elite, played a role in maintaining slavery. How common was it for non-elite families to own slaves in Dutch New York, and what did slaveholding look like for them?
Good point. There's a number of people before that try to make statements like 20% of all people in New York own slaves in this year, or 30%, or something like that. And that's a sizable number. The census, however, is only a snapshot in time. And if you said how many people own, I don't know, Ford Escorts, and you went and measured them every 10 years, it's different than how many people in their lives have ever owned a Ford Escort.
Right.
That number is a lot higher. So if it's 30% have it in one census, it's not the same people that are owning slaves in the next census, right? Next, there is a lot of renting of slaves in New York. This is a key thing. Slavery in New York, I think, is flexible, is mobile. It doesn't have a lot of records like in the South, because it's one or two people at a time being rented to their neighbor or being part of a community. I think a lot of these slaves, there's stories of them knowing geography very well. They were sent on their own to go to the store, to go to the farmer 5 miles away. The slave owner had to trust that they would come back. And I mean, to be honest, what option did they have? I mean, there was a lot of runaways, but like, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? How are you going to find a better life? It's not easy, right? So most of the time they would come back. There's for many, it needs to be some supervision, but yeah. So I'm not sure if I answered your
Yeah,
question, Nicole, but yeah, there's room to understand both how the elites, as you talk about, own slaves and how they use them, but then also the everyday person. And I think the everyday person in New York was very aware that this was going on. Maybe almost the majority of them at one point had slaves or rented them, right? And so that really pushes us more and more towards that understanding that slavery is part of the system in New York, not just some sub feature of servants that are there for rich people to look rich, right? This is part of my economic argument as well. No, slavery had a real economic purpose in New York. It wasn't superficial. It wasn't just waiting tables at rich people's houses. It was in the fields, you know, physically working.
yeah. And I think this is a great segue into how you talk about how Dutch farmers made money, real money from slavery, especially through wheat farming. Now, how did slavery in New York stack up economically compared to other places we've seen, thinking South Carolina,
Mhm.
the Chesapeake, places in the Caribbean?
Yeah. There's a lot here. I could talk about, I got a couple chapters on this type of stuff. Some of it's kind of specific, some of it is more introductory. Um, strong view in the historiography of American slavery is called, one of them is called the staple thesis. The idea that slavery grows best where the crops grow best that are profitable. And usually this is like cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, and that's where we get slaves. And this is a very geographic, sort of materialist explanation of where slavery goes. And I think that that makes some sense. But what I think is slavery is always a choice, right? And so you can be profitable or not profitable or marginally profitable, but you have to choose to get into slavery.
Right.
New Yorkers chose to get into slavery, and I think they were profitable at it. And the indication of the profit is the prices of the slaves, the fact that they kept buying them, that they kept using them. For 200 years, the Dutch were farming wheat in New York with slaves. I mean, literally 200 years. Jaap Jacobs, historian, has just rewritten the origin of slavery in New York to 1627. So it's precisely 200 years. Um, and so they they make money by selling the cash crop, which is wheat. And the slaves are essential for making sure that they can bring in that harvest. The 2 or 3 weeks in the summer, like in July, where the wheat is ready, they need laborers to cut it down. And having slaves guarantees that they can sow, but then also reap this cash crop because it's white flour that's the most profitable. I mean, rye and corn and other things are local domestic market. White wheat gets shipped to Europe,
Right.
to the Caribbean, and they make money on this. And so having slaves is part of that. It is difficult work. I'm a little bit too into being a historian. I actually planted a field of wheat when I
Oh,
did this
wow.
project. I did, I don't know, maybe an eighth of an acre, right?
It's difficult.
And I sowed it, I cut it with a scythe, I beat it with a flail, I sifted it with an electric fan, and then made a $600 pancake, right? The equivalent amount of labor that went into this to do this. And so you needed all hands on deck to grow and process the wheat. And the family wasn't enough. And the excess free labor in the summer was all bid up. So it was hard to get the white free New Yorkers to work. So if you have black slaves, you've got that guaranteed labor, many hours to do all that type of work. And then the rest of the year, the slaves just have to be um, break even, right? So they would work on fences, work on gardens, work on
Right.
houses, everything. It's an extremely flexible form of slavery in the sense that the slaves are doing everything. lots of different types of things. It's not gang labor in a field where they're all told to go cut down the wheat. It might only be 3 people, it might be 5, it might be 10, but you know, they're working together, and then they're doing different types of things from day to day. I mean, for us, it would be extremely monotonous. I read these old journals, the farm journals that they wrote this stuff in, and they're like mowing a field 2 weeks. Right? You're out there for 2 weeks cutting the grass with a scythe. Can you imagine? I mean, so you have overdeveloped muscles and weird positions, but it's still difficult work. It's not picking cotton in the southern heat, but it's rough.
Yeah, and you can see that evidence in the bodies of enslaved people, the kind of stress fractures, the everyday work, and how their muscles were overdeveloped in certain places.
Mhm.
The other thing that you argue, and I think is really interesting to kind of think about and talk about, I mean, there's so many things that we could talk about, but this really crucial point where you say that this emancipation in New York was slow and gradual, and it was Dutch. But what made this process of emancipation in Dutch New York, I mean, take so very long,
Mhm.
whereas you see it maybe going faster than other places?
This argument is both obvious and obscure, like at the same time.
Yeah,
It's obvious because people at the time all said it. They all said, and this is actually a phrase that gets repeated anytime for the next 50 years that people pick on the Dutch or the Germans. They use the word donder and blitzen, which is actually like just murdering the Dutch and German languages, mixing them together. But they're like dunder and blitzen, and my dog's trying to climb on me. And it says, the Dutch refused to get rid of, they refused by dunder and blitzen to get rid of their slaves. And there's all these reports. The Dutch um, uh, counties with their legislators in New York oppose this, et cetera, et cetera. But finding other evidence is hard. One thing is I again measuring by counties and trying to figure out which counties are more Dutch, which ones are more English. And you see that slavery decreases faster in the counties where there's a greater percent of English people relative
wow.
to the Dutch. Now, some of that you just have to guess, you don't know. But like if you look at Staten Island, for example, in 1800, like every last name is Dutch.
Wow.
So you, I mean, almost so that own slaves. So you kind of put that as a peak, and then other ones you get a better sense of, well, Westchester is mainly English and Ulster has a high percent of Dutch. But if you rank them in order, Dutch to English, and then look at the slavery levels dropping off, there's correspondence there. It correlates. And so
Right.
the Dutch are holding on to their slaves longer because they're needed for farm labor, because the Dutch are conservative, because they don't have any moral. This is another part of this book, morality. People are afraid of
Right.
using this word, especially as historians. I work with ethicists. Even ethicists don't like the word morality because it sounds too Christian. They like the word
Right.
ethics, which is more secular.
Right.
But the Dutch had a different morality than the English in New York City. It's the William Wilberforces of the world and from England, from New England, that this anti-slavery mentality comes down into the liberal circles, the anti-slavery societies in New York City. And
Right.
this stuff has been researched before, but it's in contrast to those in New York, in Dutch rural New York. And
Mhm.
so you have different constituents in the state. Um, and yeah, that explains a lot of the difference in the decline of slavery. The rates is conceptions of morality, and it just took time for this new anti-slavery morality to work its way through. Now, of course, they joke about like World War II. After World War II, everybody was in the resistance, right? This is the joke in the
Right.
Netherlands. Well, after the end of slavery, everyone was an abolitionist
Mhm.
in their memories and their memoirs, and even among the Dutch, they're like, "Oh yeah, he was a slave owner, he was an abolitionist." It's like, come on, And um, the truth of the matter is, a lot of that history was, like I said before, whitewashed
Right.
afterwards to make the Dutch slave owners seem legitimate. In fact, you look at it at every county, and there's this mild thesis we talk about that is similar to the Southern idea that things were not so bad in the South. Everyone in their own county and in their own village says, "Oh, but it wasn't bad here," right?
Mhm.
Which tells you something. I could go on to that for a longer time, but I'll leave that there.
I really like that point, because I think that was so crucial to kind of encapsulating how very pervasive this was, and also how important it is to really be very specific about the ethnic quality and character of this enslavement as well.
Mhm.
Um, the other thing that I wanted to ask you and just think about is how does this Dutch narrative change the way, I mean, I can say that when I read your book, the thing that really jumped out at me, and other work as well, is a lot of times we associate kind of French Louisiana, right, and the French influence on the Black population and even beyond slavery as being enduring. But this story you're telling is really blew my mind, and how Dutch colonial America was for enslaved people.
Mhm.
Could you elaborate on that,
Certainly.
and
Yeah.
how this is an important aspect of understanding the experience
Mhm.
of Black people who were slaves in
Mhm.
this system?
So let me first say that I love the New Netherland Institute and support everything that they're doing. So any of these comments that follow are not an attack on them. The purpose of the New Netherland Institute was to revive this idea that the Dutch colonial Americans had a history that had been obscured. And they've done great work, but they focus until 1664. There is Dutch in New York, much larger numbers of them way after that. And something that Nicole has seen in the historiography and others have been attacking as well is this sense that the history of New York should be divided into a Dutch period and an English period, as if in 1664 all the Dutch people became English people, and there's much more continuity in the story. Dutch speakers in New York are there for at least 200 years while owning slaves. Um, it's yeah. Let me see if I lose my train of thought, Nicole. If you can bring me back to the question.
Yeah, so basically the question was just, how important it is to understand that that the Black people who are living, and people of mixed race who are living in this system of slavery, that they're having a Dutch experience, and this is an enduring
Okay.
experience.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
endured through the 19th century, and in some cases
Yeah.
into the 20th.
Yeah, so I had to back off from some of the statements that I was going to put in the book because I wanted to say very clearly that this is the largest non-English speaking form of slavery in American history. And I actually kind of believe that, but the editor was like, we're not so sure. One of the reviewers was like, we're not so sure. Well, of all the work on the French-speaking slaves in New Orleans, the numbers weren't that big. I mean, when you start talking about 40% of the New York population being Dutch-speaking slaves, 40% of the slave population, and the population is at 25,000. It starts to be, this is 8,000 or more Dutch-speaking slaves at its peak. This is a real community of people that endures for a long time, that I mean, their ethnic origins, of course, are all over the place in Africa, and even Native Americans mixed into that. Um, but they eventually learn Dutch, and they speak Dutch in the 19th century, even after they're freed. Why they stopped speaking it over time is the same reason why white speakers stopped speaking it over time. First of all, we have very few records because Dutch became a spoken language, not a written language in the 19th century. Um, African Americans flocked to New York City after the end of slavery in New York, and they had to learn English. And also, the death rates were extremely high. So there's a lot of turnover in this period and a lot of freed slaves moving into New York from other places. And so Dutch just gets swamped as a language in New York. Meanwhile, there's just a few holdouts. The work of David Stephen Cohen on the Ramapo um, um, I think of the Dutch word verblijfsel, which is the remnant of speakers in the mountains, African Americans, even was it towards the end of the 19th century. And so news reports from the 1840s and 50s still speak of Negro Dutch as this like specific group of people that are different from them elsewhere. And so that's interesting to think that there's these potentially born monolingual Dutch African Americans in the 1850s, upstate New York, walking around. I mean, it's a different type of story than one might think. So the point is, Dutch slavery is not a early colonial thing. It's not just there's only a few hundred slaves in New Netherland. It's an interesting story, but the story gets much bigger, a lot more to talk about. In the 18th century, sort of the forgotten century, the early 18th century, and the end of the 17th as well. But I started at 1700 largely because of data, the availability of data. It's hard to get it from before then. I don't know the sources, but it's not nearly as much data as the people that study the American South and have stuff. So we historians of colonial New York slavery have to dig far and wide to find stuff. And to be honest, a lot of this research I did during the COVID pandemic, and I did it online. So I've been to archives, I've done the deep archival digging, but that's not I think Nicole's book has more of that than mine. That's not the primary tact that I took here. Mine was, let's spend 6 months full time just putting things into Excel files until we can build curves of prices and location and all this type of stuff. And so I would do deep Google searches into every database I could find, and then also email museums and archives, like, do you have any more of this, et cetera, et cetera. And then I did a couple trips up to New York myself to get to those lesser known archives. And then, of course, as Nicole probably knows, and maybe you've experienced this as well, there's archives in New York that ostensibly exist that I can't seem to get into or get contact information from. Sometimes at the county level, like Bronx, I never got back a word from Bronx. Hofstra University, I don't know what's going on there, but there's great material out there that I couldn't incorporate. A lot of this data as well, I should say, has been published at the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, run out of the University of Maryland. I think they do a fantastic job. So I published 2 of my databases with them because I was tired of reading books on slavery that talked about data. And then I literally would email these historians and ask them for data. And most of them are nice. Historians are generally nice people. And they'd write me back and they would say, oh, I don't know, threw that away 10 years ago or whatever. And it's like, that data does no longer exist. Like, it's not worthless, but it only hints at something that we then can't prove, or that I couldn't add to my databases to strengthen them, because certain people working at the county level might have information that I didn't find, even though I did go county to county in my research. All right, get back to it.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking as you were talking about this data and you're kind of trying to nail it down, is thinking about when I first started in graduate school, kind of the way into kind of thinking about transatlantic slavery was David Eltis's database, transatlantic slave database. Yeah. Did that resource inspire? Was it something also to think about, kind of a way a counterpoint to what you were doing? And how would you say that your work could be used, right, in this type of way to get students thinking critically about how to approach questions like this, different ways, and etc. However you want to go with this direction.
Okay, good question. I actually emailed, you say Eltis, I don't know. I emailed him once in the process of this work, and he responded. So I'm like, great, a very senior established historian that was kind enough to say some things to me. I didn't really use the transatlantic slave database that much, primarily because some others had already done work on imports and exports of slaves into New York. So I'm thinking these names, they go way back, but it's Linden, Chase, and then most recently, I think Charles Foy is his name, who looked at this, and I did compare it to what Eltis had in that database, and it more or less corresponds to what this Charles Foy is the most recent one figured out from these stories. So that work had been done by others. I kind of checked it over, but didn't think about it too hard. And my databases, like I say, I built all myself from collecting data. So
Right.
scouring online, archive to archive, emailing lots of archivists who helped out to find stuff. Some of it was published at county or village level. Some of it was just cited in secondary sources that I just extracted it and quoted and said, okay, it's from this book. I don't know where the actual original is,
Right.
but that's where it is. But there, some of the stuff on demography, first of all, can certainly be used, and in my population type graphs can be used or copied for other locations, and similar things could be done for, say, Rhode Island or Delaware or something like that. And then the stuff on prices, I collected 3,500 prices of slaves in New York being sold, measured in probate records or advertised prices. This is another conversation about the differences between those types of quoted prices we could talk about.
Right.
But I had to, like I say, build this from scratch. Whereas a lot of the slave data on the South has been done by economic historians who are much better, have much better understanding of regressions and statistics than I do. But they base their data and analysis on one set of data that they usually didn't collect themselves. And so it's somebody in the past found, in the South, these numbers are a lot bigger, 30,000 or something New Orleans auction records, or 20,000 South Carolina probate records. And so they have a more consistent type of source database. Mine, it was more heterogeneous, but that's why you had to get into things like regressions and bring in
Right.
an economist who could help me put all this together. So yeah, like I say, we have a harder work in front of us in New York, I think, than some of the historians of slavery in the South. However, at the same time, there's so much more room to do things because slavery in the North is under-researched compared
Yeah.
to in the South. I mean, I say this with no lie or exaggeration. This is not only the first book about the economics of slavery in the North, it is the first peer-reviewed anything on the economics of slavery in the North. I mean, the only thing that comes close is Arthur Silversmith has a book from 1967 or something.
So long
It,
ago.
it ostensibly it mentions economics. It has like two numbers in it, right? It doesn't really use economic logic. It's not really economics. And so I'm a historian. I'm not an economist, but we got to use their tools to help us where there's a dearth of sources because yeah, it's a
I
difficult.
love I love this point of using the tools and the interdisciplinary work that you're using, and using some things that I think some historians might not be as comfortable, right?
Mhm.
Historians do work interdisciplinary, but as you pointed out, a lot of times they can go in different directions. I think of the fantastic work that was done by uh, um, in the probate court records in New England. Dr. Whiting does a really kind of key, crucial counting of the
Mhm.
probate records to make an argument about the presence and really proliferation of enslaved people in Suffolk County and in Boston, in the Boston area.
Mhm.
And I feel like the argument, dare I say, the controversy, right, that has swirled around of work like that, and perhaps many of the reasons that historians haven't felt as comfortable going in there, is the idea of reducing stories of enslaved
Mhm.
people to numbers. I think that you do a wonderful job of kind of walking that, right, that line, that
Mhm.
you breathe life into these stories, and into the demography. But how would you approach opening up that conversation, I think, to include different types of interdisciplinary studies in a realm where people might be more reticent to talk about enslaved people in terms of numbers and trends now in the kind of direction that many people are taking.
Yeah, thank you. And that's an important point. And I say this in the introduction to the book, that we have to use any tool that's at our disposal, that I am not the one who is treating these enslaved people as numbers. Others in the past treated them as numbers and gave them prices. I am using that information to make interpretations about where is slavery more expensive or less expensive, where is it efficient, what is the direction that slaves are being sold in the market. And these are uncomfortable things for everybody. I would say a lot of people, probably everybody. But it's not something that we should avoid. The other tool I should mention is really before, I would say, like Jeroen de Wolf's book in 2017. There, I'm a little hesitant to say this, I'm not totally sure, but there really hasn't been a lot of historians that spoke or read Dutch that have looked at New York slavery before then. And now almost all of us are. So Andrea, I don't know, Nicole, what your Dutch language abilities are, but you're in your book, you use Dutch sources, you read this or had somebody read it and translate. I'm not sure. You tell me more about, I'm going to interview you now. Tell me about how you, because I'm actually teaching the Dutch language on the side. That's my obsession. So we could do this presentation in Dutch. If we want to switch to our international audience.
I've had the wonderful the wonderful opportunity to hear you speak beautiful Dutch when I'm dropping in on a conversation you were having with Professor Dika Hondias, which was fantastic. I always tell the story that my language, I think it's interesting when we think about an American, and we're both Americans, but American scholars, that language learning has always seemed, at least it was for me, as kind of this reticent thing. And that was one of the most terrifying moments of my scholarly career, when my then dissertation advisor was like, you're going to have to learn Dutch, and you're going to have to learn, and then once you learn that, you're going to have to learn early modern paleography. And I was terrified. Truth be told, it is hard for me to gain language knowledge. My mother is a fluent French speaker. I have been trying to gain fluency in French my entire life. I do not claim fluency, maybe conversance, I can say. But I think that, in terms of, this was an extreme, it's a path I'm still trying to kind of master, but it's one I think was absolutely important to understand, to be able to read the language, right? To be able to understand the documents, because I was blown away by how many documents were in Dutch, and to not be able to, and how different the documents were. And of course, I also had a village around me kind of helping me along on my journey. I cannot claim that everything I did was, it was from just my own self, but just a village of people who were also working with me. And some of the things and some of the conclusions people made about what people's experiences were just wrong, right? It was just incorrect translation. And that shocked me. And some of the translations were even more brutal, right? Even more kind of honest to a certain, in what you might think was on the page. So
and some of it's even broader contextually than some people give it credit for. It's not only that you can read or have somebody translate the sources. So for example, I have this part of a later chapter that talks about the varieties of Dutch spoken in New York, or written Dutch at the end of the 18th century. Even within one family, I'm trying to remember their names at the moment, but there was the father and his wife, and then the grandfather. And they all wrote with different hands, different abilities, sometimes in English, sometimes in Dutch, depending on who they were talking to, right? And just getting the letter, just getting the text of that letter doesn't tell you the story, like, oh, this woman, and she even says, het valt me niet makkelijk. It's not easy for me to write, but she like scribbles. I don't know exactly if this is true, but my advisor in grad school, who was a gender historian, she said that in the 18th century, men were the primary letter writers. So we
Mhm.
think of letter writing in the 20th century, at least, as more of a women's activity, but in the 18th and 19th century, it was more men, and so
Yeah.
that's why you would see the differences in the ability of the language. Now, some of that kind of stuff was important for me to shape my story and give it context.
Mhm.
I wish there would have been more. I mean, there are lots of sources, but it's hard, slow going, and I think there can be more done on that. I always lamented the fact that there's no written Dutch from an African American himself.
Yes.
I mean, that we know of, and in fact, so much of it has been interpreted by English ears, travelers that go through the country, heard a few words of Dutch. We get this itinerarium of Alexander Hamilton, a different Alexander the Hamilton. Um,
The doctor.
that yeah, that is it's a terrible source. I mean, it's an English speaker hearing a black guy maybe saying something in New York in Dutch that he doesn't really understand. And there's like entire articles based on just one line from that itinerarium that I don't understand how we can actually get anything out of it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well,
But
this has been so wonderful, and I don't want to leave our conversation here without asking you, what is the biggest takeaway that you hope your readers get from this from your book and from your work in general?
um I would say the takeaway is that as historians, we all need to be a lot more careful. So I think there's been a lot of pretty good historians who have worked in this field, and yet I'm critical in the book of almost everyone. I don't think nobody is without fault, but there's lots of things that just never were checked, that were sort of assumed. It's like you come up with an idea, you find two or three things that support it, and you say that was it. Those are, I mean, in Nicole, in reviewing her book, I talk about this sort of postmodernist view that she has about like what sources are kept and what can we trust, and you know um can we trust the data is another question. I don't know, but we can't trust the anecdotes. I mean, if we take three anecdotes and tell the entire history of New York slavery from three things that we know happened in New York City, for example, the slave revolts of 1712 and 1741. To me, these are way overplayed in the story. This is not where the main story is. That's just, as they say in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. Like
Mm.
that's people are attracted to these types of things, and they were in some ways easy to write about because we had direct information. But there's not much there. Like you can't really, I don't know. You don't get a sense of what's going on in New York if you only study Horace Manden's diary of the 1841 slave revolt. It's pretty blank.
Yeah. I think that them's fighting words, but they're also very, very, very important words, right? And I think that this is incredible way to open up the conversation and open up the discussion to the people who have been so nicely listening to our conversation.
Yes, and I want to thank you all for joining. We had a very big turnout tonight. I'm very pleased. This book deserved it. These guests deserved it. I'm going to try to restrain myself and not ask questions. Maybe I'll save those for later. I want to remind everyone, if you do have questions, please send them in now. We're going to work through the ones that we've got in queue, and then we're going to call it a night. So Michael, we have a question here, basically just asking for some numbers, particularly on the question of New York City. We touched on this, right? This was part of the reason we very consciously had you in to talk about your book, even though one of the major arguments you're making is that New York City is overplayed. So Peter Boyson asks, how many slaves were there in New York when? And how did that rack up against the total population in the state, I'm assuming?
I'd have to think about it a little bit, and I got all sorts of charts that do this.
Yeah, you do.
Even in the early 18th century, when New York City had the greatest proportion of the enslaved population in the state that it would ever have, it was still like 25%. And so I break it into Long Island, Manhattan, and the Hudson Valley. Now, if you measured it differently, if you included Queens and Brooklyn or something as New York City, sure, the numbers for New York City would be a lot larger, but Brooklyn is farming communities in this period. It's not
Yeah.
part
Yeah.
of the city. And the same thing, like even with most of Westchester and above, these are rural slaveholding people. They're not living in the city. And so it goes from like maybe a peak of 20 or 25% of the entire population of the state of New York down to consistently 10%, 8%, 5%. You know, most of the slaves, the largest slaveholding county in New York is Albany. Now, Albany, the problem is the borders change every 10 or 20 years. They're carving a new county out of Albany. So that makes the demography incredibly difficult because you're always having to say, you know, the Albany County lines at this time, which are these counties, XYZ, certain points of them. And then even some counties adjust the borders. So that adds extra confusion. Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that answered your question, Peter. I mean, the percent goes, it's small, especially in the period of emancipation. New Yorkers in Manhattanites emancipate their slaves faster. And I think some of that is because there's a very ready market for selling labor there. And so a lot of the slaves in New York City have experience being rented or being told to go work on their own, and at the end of the year bring back a certain number of dollars to the person that owns them. And this gives them like, I call it a foot in the door, like the experience of freedom. And eventually they're using this to pay for they're buying them their own freedom, or they're absconding and just working for free, right? And so it's the liberal morality of New York City that leads to the end of slavery, but there's also economic stuff going on where it would be easier for people to be emancipated in New York City than, like, if you run away in Kinderhook or something, you don't have any support structure, you don't have any experience outside of the area.
Well, your book makes a very good point of especially on the economic side of the distinctions there and why it's such a bigger story in the Hudson Valley. We have a comment here with a question at the end. What you're describing sounds very similar to the background of slavery in New England or northeastern New Jersey, e.g. Bergen County. Have you identified how many, and you make several references to New Jersey and how this, you know, population spills over significantly in New Jersey, but that aside, the question is, have you identified how many Dutch left New York when the English took control of the colony and how many were moved with them? Yeah.
That's a very difficult question. That goes back to 1664, so that predates my study.
Or your book.
But Dirk Mao has had this discussion with me. He talks about a lot of these Long Islanders moving into upper New Jersey and from Manhattan moving west as well. That's research that could be done. It's interesting. For New Jersey, in fact, my chapter 3 on slave prices incorporates a lot of New Jersey. The number of Dutch-speaking slaves in New Jersey, I think, is, I use the same number, 40% of the population of the Dutch slaves in New York, roughly. And so anytime you talk about New York's Dutch slaves being 5,000, add another 40% that are in New Jersey, and it's to me a common market for slaves and a very similar culture, and so it's connected. There's a number of reasons why the book focuses only on New York. Is at some point we have to set parameters. And this is one of the real difficulties in telling this story. People tell stories of the colonial period or New York State or the United States. But what happens when histories are transnational or trans period or something in many ways here? This is a story that transcends the colonies, the Dutch, the English colonies, the early American Republic. It transcends the state borders of New York and New Jersey, political reigns, right? And so I think it's always easier to just focus on some isolated island that has a very clear 100-year period of rule by one person and focus on that. A lot of us with New York, we're carving out and even debating what are the parameters that are relevant that we should study. And one of the things that we're doing is aligning or smoothing out that difference between the Dutch and English periods, because the transition was not abrupt. It's very gradual.
Yeah. As many historians of Dutch New York have said, good book on that if people are interested is the work by Joyce Goodfriend a few years ago. Ed writes, when you say they rented out slaves during the short period when wheat crops were ready to harvest, does this mean they were that those rented out were excess to the needs the owners had to harvest, or were they rented out once the owner's crop was reaped?
I don't know. I mean, both ways, always different ways. There's just lots of rental agreements, usually within a town. And I think this is the difficult thing again with sources. We don't have, I mean, one thing we have a lot of are slave sales and runaway slave documents, and that's a bulk of 2 different chapters of my book. We don't have a lot of documents about one guy loaned his slave to his neighbor in exchange for a day, for an exchange for a basket of some sort of grain or fruit or something like that, right? But through context, by building this up, we see this happens all the time. And so once again, it just points to the flexibility. I think slavery is communal in New York. Supervisory nature of slavery has always been communal, but the way that slaves became part of the community was working for different people, different times of the year, and they were in high demand in July.
I mean, the side-by-side nature of free labor and, I'm not sure how much differentiation we should make there, but, between free labor and enslaved labor in that part of your story was striking to me. It's not my century of expertise, but,
Why was it striking? What do you mean?
Striking in the set, like I wanted to know far more about how did that play out, right? How did it play out sort of culturally, socially, politically, like and again, I'm not a 19th century historian, right? Maybe maybe I'm sort of betraying my ignorance and this is not so uncommon in the South, but it seemed to me that was that caught my attention.
Yeah. Now there are statements in some of these early county histories about white men and black men working side by side in perfect harmony. Well, that's not the case, but they did work together.
Yeah.
And a lot of it seems to be also unsupervised. So simply you send somebody out, your responsibility today is that field. Better be done when you get back, right?
Yeah.
It's not a supervisory like a whip, and there's a lot of whipping in New York. I have a section on that for control and punishment, but it doesn't seem to be driving work as people have made some arguments happen in the South in certain circumstances. There's a lot of sense of very mixed groups of people going out into the harvest. Could be men, women, children scooping up the grain behind them, raking things. It could be free men, enslaved men, these children of slaves bound to labor, indentured servants, all working together. Not on terms of perfect harmony, but certainly working together.
Yeah. Lynn Hayden Finley, hi Lynn, good to see you again, writes, I understand that in New York City, enslaved people were able to meet in churches. They established and support each other in this way. This would be, after the years after the early 1800s. In a rural situation, this would have been more difficult. How did the enslaved outside New York City support each other or their communities? What did community look like there?
This is a difficult question and one that I don't think I have a thorough answer for. Um, there are some examples of slaves gathering together for, we would say, parties or events, or of course later on for the Pinkster Festival and things like that that brought people together. When we talk about the Dutch Reformed Church, this has been the attempt for a lot of people trying to connect the Dutch Reformed Church or the Reformed Church in America and slavery by the one way they do it is measuring baptism records or looking for participation in the churches. I feel like we still don't have a good handle on this at all. Like Andrea Mosterman's got some good stuff on this. Dirk Mao is actually, to me, like the expert on this period when it comes to the Dutch Reformed religion in early colony. And I think he would probably agree with me that we don't really know. There's a diversity of participation in different churches and different communities and how welcome African Americans were in the churches, whether they mostly sat in separate places, but how many actually became baptized members of the churches versus how many didn't. There's some sense that they're being inculcated in the religion of the Dutch Reformed Church, but they probably also have their own syncretic religions going on behind the scenes. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to answer that from the data and the sources that we have. Like that's just not there, and that's there's the old story of the economist who talk about, why are you looking for something in the dark and not where you think you lost it or in the light, because over there it's dark, right? You go where the sources are available and you tell what you can. I would love to know more about their community formation, but it's not there so far.
Yeah. Ann Haddad asks, what about manumissions? Were there many fewer within Dutch communities than in English communities?
Yes, I believe so. This statistics and the chapter, I think it's 5 or 6, the chapter that talks about the slaves sold south does this. So instead of measuring the demographic growth of the population that I did in a little bit in chapter 1, which was based on an article from before, chapter, I think 6 it is, measures the decline of slavery in New York. And one of the factors in that is emancipation. So it could decline because of deaths, being sold away, running away, or emancipation. So I have to measure these different numbers. And I do come up with some totals for how many were likely manumitted in New York State. It's in the thousands. I can't remember exactly.
I
Something.
think you said more likely 2 to 3.
Yeah, 2 to 3.
And the common statistic was something on the order of 10 to 15, right?
Well, no, that's the common statistic, and there's various ones between 10 and 20 or more of how many New York enslaved men or people were sold south. So my recalculation of that is it's still hard to know, but it's much smaller, but it's between 1 and 5,000 at the end of slavery were sold to the south. The actual number of emancipations that happened in that period from 1799 to 1827, I think it's in the range of 2 to 3,000. I can't remember, but that's one thing I didn't collect in a database. These exist at the county level, these emancipation documents, but they're incomplete. So I relied on other people who had already counted them. And I said, okay, well, if these are the estimates for these counties, let's add in some other counties that we don't know about. But it appears that more are being emancipated again in the English dominant communities. So there could be Dutch people who are speaking English, but still identifying more culturally as Dutch. So there's a lot of teasing out the difference between Dutch and English. It's difficult to do. But any way you cut the pie, it appears that the Dutch are not emancipating as fast as the English. And so, yeah, that chapter really gets into the calculations of the decline of slavery, which most slaves in New York were never freed. They died in enslavement. That's what the gradual emancipation program did. And then it made the children of slaves bound to service to their master for a certain number of years, even into the 1840s. I've got other stuff in there about why I think the census of 1830 and 1840 are wrong for New York. It lists 75 slaves in 1830, which is a legal impossibility because slavery was ended 3 years before. The short answer is these are not enslaved persons that are traveling in the North with their Southern slaveholders, and these are not slaves. Most of them are either children of slaves bound to service listed in the wrong category, or they're enumerator heirs of wrong categories. They shifted all these free Black women into this enslaved column because of the confusion of the census form.
Yeah.
And these kind of errors are consistent in these censuses, or I've been joking censi, as if the plural is Latin or something. But these types of errors are in these censuses, and then people are accepting this data as legitimate. We really have to be critical of it.
It does speak to your. I'll join in and say, without claiming any great expertise in this area, I think it does speak to a larger problem of, we need to be more fluent in these tools, right? And it truly does, I think, need to be more a part of the programming.
Well, there's no training and no jobs in historical demography, so I don't think anybody is going to be getting into that field anytime soon.
Yeah.
And it's huge barriers to entry to get on the same page as these demographers, because what they only work in the modern era. Demography is a modern science. It focuses with modern data. They don't. You have 1,000 of something, they say it's not enough. Come back to me with 1,000,000 data points.
Yeah. We have another question here about the point that that Dutch became a spoken, not a written language in the 19th century. Can you suggest, they ask, can you suggest any ways or sources to explore how and when Dutch speakers made that transition?
I can,
right?
in fact, if you wait about 5 or 6 years, I'll have a book on this.
Okay.
So that's I want to, unless somebody does it before me, I shouldn't mention, somebody's going to scoop my idea, but I'm writing a history of the Dutch language in North America. But it's not easy. It's going to take some time.
Yeah. Another writes, it's not common for African Americans, I guess, today to have Dutch last names. Did the Dutch not extend those names, which we assume English slave owners did?
They use their last names. There's plenty of African Americans in New York and elsewhere in the country today that have Dutch last names. It might be overwhelmed just by the total numbers of slaves in the South, because even if we talk about 8,000 maybe Dutch speaking slaves in New York at their peak, and some of these may have learned Dutch and then lived with English masters and had their names changed or whatever. This pales in comparison to the number of slaves in the South. Isn't it what the traditional number is 4 million or something, right? I mean, this just completely overwhelms. So it's not likely, just going about your own daily life, that you would encounter African Americans with Dutch last names, unless you're hyper aware of it, like I am. So I've met a few. And Nicole's nodding, so maybe you know some people that do.
Yeah, actually, interestingly enough, when we were doing my family history, my mother's father's last name is Cole. It was spelled C-O-L-E. But as we went back and back and back, we realized it was actually K-O-O-L. And so some of that, I think, might even just be English transliterations, how it sounds into an English composite name. So a lot of African Americans have names that were originally spelled and pronounced in Dutch ways, or Cole is pronounced like that in Dutch, only spelled differently.
Yeah, and quick plug as well for Deborah Bruno has a book, Hudson
Yeah.
Valley Reckoning or something like that, that deals with her family and the tradition of slavery and her deep past. And she says something, if I was talking to her about this, it's like if you have Dutch ancestors in New York, you probably have Dutch slaveholding ancestors. And if you have African American ancestors in New York, those were interwoven with the English circles. Some of those ancestors spoke Dutch. Like there was a lot of mixing between them.
Michael, we're stopping a little short here, but I want to thank you again. I want to congratulate you again on an excellent book. Really fascinating, really learned a lot, really enjoyable. Nicole, I want to thank you for an excellent job as moderator. Excellent to see you. I want to remind everyone that this will be posted to our YouTube channel shortly. And I want to thank you all for joining in, and we'll be posting our next event on the calendar shortly. I hope you'll all come back to join me, and I hope Nicole and Michael, you enjoy the rest of your night.
Yeah, thank you both and the audience. I really appreciate this. You guys are great.
Wonderful to be here.
Yep.
An honor to have you.
Cheers.